Rachel's perfect marriage unravels as she secretly engages in a steamy affair with Mark, her passionate yoga instructor, while her unsuspecting husband Tom, initially the picture of devotion, discovers the truth and spirals into an affair of his own. As their lives become entangled in lies and forbidden desires, both must confront the consequences of their betrayals. In a shocking twist, they reach an agreement to exchange lovers, embracing their dangerous new reality with unsettling allure. You just need to subscribe and like to hear different stories every day. Rachel had always been the perfect wife in the eyes of everyone who knew her. To her friends and neighbors, she was kind, loving, and dedicated. To her husband, Tom, their marriage seemed strong, the kind that was built on mutual respect and years of shared experiences. Tom, a hard-working architect, adored Rachel and trusted her implicitly. He had no reason to suspect that anything might be wrong. But lately, Rachel had begun to feel restless. It wasn't that she didn't love Tom, she did. But after years of stability, something inside her had shifted. The quiet evenings they spent together, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt routine, predictable. She craved something more, something exciting. It was during one of her yoga classes that she met him, Mark. He was charming in a way that Tom wasn't. Where Tom was steady and dependable, Mark was spontaneous, full of energy, and undeniably attractive. At first, Rachel told herself it was harmless. Flirting during class was just fun, a way to break the monotony. But soon, their interactions grew more intense, and before she knew it, she was agreeing to meet him outside of class. Their first meeting was innocent enough, just a casual coffee in the city. But the attraction between them was palpable. Rachel found herself drawn to Mark in ways she hadn't expected. His touch, even when accidental, sent shivers through her, igniting feelings she hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, they met at a hotel, the first of many secret rendezvous. The thrill of sneaking around behind Tom's back excited her, made her feel alive in a way that her marriage hadn't in a long time. Every touch, every kiss with Mark was electric, filled with a tension that was impossible to ignore. In those moments with Mark, Rachel felt no guilt. It was as though the world outside their affair didn't exist. But once she returned home to Tom, the weight of her actions would settle on her shoulders, though not heavily enough to stop her. Tom's love was a comfortable constant, something she never wanted to lose. Yet, she couldn't pull herself away from Mark. Meanwhile, Tom remained blissfully unaware of Rachel's affair. He was busy with work, his latest project demanding long hours at the office. He trusted Rachel completely, never questioning her increasingly frequent yoga retreats or her late nights with friends. In his mind, Rachel was everything a husband could hope for. But deep down, a part of Rachel knew this couldn't last forever. There was always the risk of Tom finding out, of everything crumbling apart. And though she cared for Tom, the risk only added to the thrill of it all. Their marriage, once steady and strong, was now a house of cards, built on secrets and deception. And as Rachel continued her affair with Mark, the foundation of her life with Tom began to shift, though she refused to acknowledge it. Since you have read this far, don't worry. The exciting part of the novel is coming soon. Rachel's secret affair with Mark had evolved into something far more intense than she'd ever anticipated. What began as casual flirtation had grown into an undeniable force that consumed her thoughts, driving her to seek more and more moments alone with him. Each meeting was more dangerous, more thrilling than the last, and Rachel found herself lost in the heat of their forbidden connection. One evening, Rachel and Mark met at a secluded hotel just outside the city. The anticipation built between them as soon as the door closed behind them, the soft click echoing through the room like a promise. The air felt charged, thick with unspoken desires. Rachel's heart raced as Mark's fingers grazed her arm, sending a ripple of heat through her entire body. It was always like this with him, every touch, every glance filled with a tension that left her breathless. The way his hand lingered on the small of her back, guiding her closer, made her feel like a live wire, every nerve in her body on edge. His presence was magnetic, drawing her in until she could hardly think of anything else but him. They stood there for a moment, the silence heavy between them, before Mark's lips found hers. The kiss was slow at first, deliberate, as though he was savoring every second. Rachel responded in kind, her body leaning into his, her hands sliding up his chest as she lost herself in the taste of him. There was a hunger in their kiss, a desperate need that neither could ignore. Mark's hand slid down her back, tracing the curve of her waist before stopping just above the hem of her dress. The heat from his touch seared through the fabric, and Rachel's breath hitched as he pulled her closer, his lips traveling down her neck. His movements were slow, almost tortuous, as though he enjoyed watching her body react to every subtle shift of his hands. Rachel's mind raced, torn between the thrill of the moment and the nagging guilt that lingered at the edges of her consciousness. But here, in this room, she allowed herself to forget about Tom, to forget about the life she'd built with him. All that mattered was the way Mark made her feel alive, desired, like every part of her was a secret waiting to be uncovered. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows on the walls as they moved together. Mark's fingers deftly found the zipper of her dress, his touch sending shivers down her spine as he slowly unzipped it. The dress slipped from her shoulders, pooling at her feet, and for a moment, Rachel stood there, her breath shallow, her body tense with anticipation. Mark stepped back, his eyes dark as they roamed over her, taking in every inch of her exposed skin. There was something predatory in his gaze, a hunger that made Rachel's pulse quicken. She could feel his eyes tracing the lines of her body, and she reveled in the power of his gaze, the way it made her feel both vulnerable and invincible all at once. He reached for her again, his hands sliding over the curve of her hips, pulling her flush against him. His touch was firm but gentle, a silent command that Rachel was all too willing to follow. Every movement was deliberate, every touch calculated to heighten the tension between them. There was no rush, no urgency, only the slow, seductive dance of two people who knew exactly how to push each other to the edge of desire. Rachel closed her eyes, letting the sensation of Mark's hands and lips overwhelm her. Every brush of his fingers against her skin felt like fire, igniting a need deep within her that she couldn't deny. Her body responded to him without hesitation, moving in perfect sync with his, as if they were two parts of the same unspoken rhythm. They continued this slow, deliberate dance, their bodies entwined in a delicate balance of temptation and restraint. Mark's hands traced every curve of Rachel's body, his lips following in their wake, leaving a trail of heat and longing in their path. It was intoxicating, the way he made her feel like she was the only thing that mattered, like time itself had stopped just for them. But even in the midst of their stolen moments, a small voice in Rachel's mind reminded her of Tom, of the life she was betraying with every touch, every kiss. She pushed the thought aside, burying it beneath the weight of her desire for Mark. Here, in this room, she could be someone else, someone who wasn't bound by the rules of marriage and fidelity. As their bodies moved together, the tension between them reached its peak, the air around them thick with the promise of what was to come. Rachel's breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling with anticipation as Mark's hands roamed lower, teasing her with the barest of touches. She was on the edge now, caught between the guilt she refused to acknowledge and the pleasure she couldn't resist. And then, in the quietest moment, Rachel's phone buzzed in her bag, a reminder of the world outside this room. Tom's name flashed on the screen, and for the briefest second, guilt crashed over her like a wave. But she didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she let the phone fall silent, allowing herself to sink deeper into Mark's embrace, surrendering to the desires she had long tried to suppress. The night stretched on, their bodies moving together in perfect harmony, each touch and kiss more intoxicating than the last. And as the tension between them finally broke, Rachel felt a sense of release, not just from the physical pleasure, but from the weight of the secret she was carrying. For now, in this room, she could forget about the consequences and lose herself in the heat of the moment. Now that you have come this far, don't worry. The most exciting part of the novel begins here. The affair had become a regular part of Rachel's life, like a secret world she slipped into whenever she needed to feel alive again. Mark was always waiting, always ready to offer the passion and excitement that her marriage to Tom seemed to lack. But the more time Rachel spent with Mark, the more she noticed the subtle changes in her own home. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in Tom's behavior hinted at something beneath the surface, something Rachel tried her best to ignore. Tom had always been the ideal husband. Steady, supportive, and kind, he worked hard to provide for their life together. Yet lately, he had been coming home later from work, his once warm smile now tinged with a hint of weariness. He hadn't said anything to Rachel about her increased absences or the way she seemed distracted, but his silence felt heavy. It was as if he sensed that something was wrong, but didn't know how to confront it. One evening, Rachel returned home from another secret meeting with Mark. The house was quiet when she entered, the faint hum of the television coming from the living room. Tom was sitting on the couch, his back to her, staring at the screen, but clearly not paying attention to whatever was on. Rachel hesitated in the doorway, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of her deception hanging in the air between them. "Hey," she said softly, trying to sound casual as she slipped off her coat. Tom didn't turn around at first. He was quiet for a moment longer before finally speaking, his voice low and measured. "You've been out a lot lately." Rachel froze, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected him to confront her, at least not so directly. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yeah, I've been busy. Yoga classes, dinners with friends, you know." Tom finally turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of concern and something else, something darker. "You seem different, Rachel." There it was, the crack in their perfect marriage, small but undeniable. Rachel felt a wave of guilt crash over her, but it was quickly followed by a surge of defiance. She had done nothing wrong, at least. That's what she kept telling herself. This was her escape, her chance to feel like more than just Tom's wife. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice tight. Tom's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he looked away, his expression hardening. "Maybe I'm just imagining things." But Rachel knew he wasn't. He wasn't imagining the way she pulled away from him in bed, the way her mind wandered during their conversations. And though Tom hadn't yet figured out what was really going on, Rachel could feel the foundation of their marriage starting to tremble. That night, as they lay in bed, the silence between them was deafening. Rachel turned her back to Tom, her thoughts racing, unable to shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the end. She had thought she could keep her two lives separate, that her affair with Mark would never interfere with her marriage. But now, with Tom's growing suspicions, everything felt fragile. A few days later, Rachel found herself in Mark's apartment again. The excitement of their affair had once filled her with a sense of freedom, but now there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made her feel anxious. As she lay beside Mark, their bodies tangled together in the aftermath of yet another stolen moment, Rachel's mind wandered back to Tom. Mark sensed her distraction and leaned in, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered, "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" Rachel flinched, guilt creeping up her spine. She didn't answer at first, but the truth was undeniable. She was thinking about Tom, about how much he didn't know, about the way his eyes had searched hers just days before, trying to understand what had changed between them. "It's not that simple," Rachel finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark pulled back slightly, his eyes dark with curiosity. "Does it make you feel guilty?" Rachel stared at the ceiling, her chest tightening. She hadn't let herself feel guilty until now. She had convinced herself that her affair was something separate from her marriage, something she needed to keep herself from feeling trapped. But now, with Tom's suspicions growing, the weight of it all was beginning to crush her. Mark's hand slid down her arm, his touch gentle but insistent. "You can't live in both worlds, Rachel. Sooner or later, you'll have to choose." The words lingered in the air, hanging between them like an unspoken ultimatum. Rachel didn't respond, but deep down, she knew Mark was right. She had been living a lie, balancing her life with Tom and her affair with Mark as if they could coexist forever. But now the cracks in her perfect life were starting to show, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it all together. That night, as she drove home, Rachel's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She loved Tom, or at least, she thought she did. But what she had with Mark felt real in a way her marriage hadn't in years. And yet, the thought of losing Tom, of breaking the life they had built together, filled her with dread. When she arrived home, Tom was waiting for her. He was standing by the window, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Rachel's heart sank as she stepped inside, the weight of her secret pressing down on her harder than ever. "Rachel," Tom began, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Tom's words hung heavy in the air, the weight of them settling into the pit of Rachel's stomach. She had always known this conversation was coming, but now that it was here, she felt unprepared, like she had been caught in the act, even though Tom didn't yet know the full extent of her betrayal. Rachel took a deep breath and nodded, her heart racing as she sat down on the couch across from Tom. He remained by the window for a moment, looking out at the darkening sky, before finally turning to face her. His expression was guarded, but Rachel could see the hurt lurking beneath the surface, the quiet devastation of a man who had begun to realize that the life he thought he had built was slowly unraveling. "I've noticed things, Rachel," Tom began, his voice steady but tense. "You've been distant, distracted. You're out more than you used to be. And when you're here, it's like you're not really present." Rachel swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She wanted to deny it, to brush off his concerns with some half-hearted excuse, but she couldn't bring herself to lie, at least, not anymore. Instead, she looked down at her hands, unable to meet Tom's gaze. "I don't know what's going on with you," Tom continued, stepping closer. "But I can feel it, Rachel. Something's wrong." Rachel's chest tightened as guilt surged through her, threatening to spill over. She had always thought she could handle this, that she could keep her affair with Mark separate from her life with Tom. But now, sitting here, with Tom standing over her, his eyes filled with pain and confusion, Rachel realized just how fragile her double life had become. "I didn't want to say anything," Tom said softly, his voice cracking just slightly, "because I didn't want to believe it. But now, I can't ignore it anymore." Rachel finally looked up at him, her heart breaking at the sight of the hurt in his eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could she explain what she had done? How could she tell him that the woman he thought he knew had been lying to him for months? Are you seeing someone else?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. She had been prepared for a confrontation, but not for this, not for Tom to ask her so directly. For a moment, she considered denying it, telling him that he was imagining things, that it was all in his head. But the look in his eyes told her he wouldn't believe her. He already knew the truth, he just needed her to say it. Rachel's throat tightened as she nodded, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Yes." Tom's face fell, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had suddenly been placed upon them. He sat down heavily in the armchair across from Rachel, running a hand through his hair as he tried to process what she had just admitted. "How long?" he asked after a long silence, his voice strained. Rachel hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to hurt him any more than she already had, but there was no use in lying now. "A few months," she admitted, her voice trembling. Tom let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as he struggled to hold himself together. "Why, Rachel? Why did you do this?" Rachel bit her lip, tears stinging her eyes. She had asked herself that question 1,000 times, but now, sitting here with Tom, she didn't have a clear answer. It wasn't that she didn't love him, she did. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. Their marriage had become comfortable, predictable. And in her search for excitement, she had found herself drifting further and further away from Tom. "I don't know," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." Tom shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and sorrow. "You just let it happen." Rachel looked away, unable to face him. "I didn't plan it," she said softly. "It wasn't something I was looking for. But you didn't stop it either," Tom shot back, his voice growing more strained with each word. "You could have stopped it, Rachel. But you didn't." The room fell silent, the air between them thick with tension. Rachel could feel the weight of Tom's words pressing down on her, crushing her beneath the guilt she had been trying so hard to ignore. "I thought we were happy," Tom said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was enough." Rachel's heart shattered at his words. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that he was enough, that this wasn't his fault. But she knew that wasn't true. She had made the choice to stray, to seek out something outside of their marriage. And now, she was paying the price for it. "I'm sorry," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." Tom let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Well, you did. You hurt me, Rachel. And now, I don't know how to fix this." The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of their shattered marriage hanging over them like a dark cloud. Rachel didn't know what to say. What could she say? She had destroyed the trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship, and now, she wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom stood up, his expression weary and defeated. "I need some time," he said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I need to think about what happens next." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face as she watched him walk away. She wanted to call out to him, to beg him to stay, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the door closed behind Tom, Rachel collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. She had known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. Her affair with Mark had given her the excitement she craved, but now it had cost her everything. You have read so much. Don't forget to subscribe, and like weeks passed after that devastating conversation. Tom had moved out temporarily, citing work as an excuse to stay with a colleague. The space between them felt vast, as if the distance had only magnified the cracks in their marriage. Rachel had thought that the worst was behind her, but with every day that passed, the weight of her choices grew heavier. She barely heard from Tom, and the silence between them was deafening. Mark, sensing her emotional turmoil, had become more persistent, urging Rachel to make a decision. He wanted her to leave Tom, to start something new with him, but Rachel wasn't ready to make such a definitive move. The excitement that had once defined their affair now felt suffocating, as if the walls of their secret world were closing in on her. One night, after yet another call from Mark, Rachel found herself sitting alone in the dark, a glass of wine in her hand, and her thoughts spinning out of control. She had been avoiding the truth for so long, telling herself that she could balance both worlds, that she could have the passion and excitement with Mark while maintaining the stability and love she had with Tom. But now, both parts of her life felt like they were slipping through her fingers. Just as Rachel was about to call it a night, her phone buzzed. Tom's name flashed across the screen, and her heart jumped. She hadn't heard from him in days, and a part of her feared that he had made his decision one that didn't include her. With trembling hands, she answered. Rachel. Tom's voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he had rehearsed what he was going to say. I think we need to talk. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope bubbling up inside her. Okay, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. When? Now, Tom said, and before she could protest, he added, I'm outside. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, then rushed to the window. Sure enough, Tom's car was parked out front, his silhouette visible in the driver's seat. She hesitated for a second, then grabbed her coat and hurried outside, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to say, all the ways she wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. Tom stepped out of the car as she approached, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her, as if trying to gauge what kind of response she expected. Rachel felt her stomach twist in knots, unsure of what he was going to say. Can we go for a drive? He finally asked, his voice soft but firm. Rachel nodded, climbing into the passenger seat without a word. The silence between them was thick as Tom drove, the city lights flickering outside the window as they left the neighborhood. Rachel's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, her guilt and regret threatening to spill over, but she kept silent, waiting for Tom to speak first. After what felt like an eternity, Tom pulled into a quiet park, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the empty lot. He turned off the engine, but didn't make any move to get out of the car. Instead, he sat there, staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Rachel, he began slowly, his voice calm but laced with an emotion she couldn't quite place. I've had a lot of time to think about us, about what you did, about what I want. Rachel's throat tightened, her hands trembling in her lap. I'm so sorry, Tom, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Tom turned to face her, his expression softer than she expected. I know you're sorry, Rachel, but sorry doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change how much you broke my trust. Rachel's heart sank, tears stinging her eyes. I know it doesn't. Tom took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for what he was about to say. But what I've realized is, I haven't been honest with you either. Rachel blinked, confusion washing over her. What do you mean? Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I've been angry with you, furious actually, but I also realized that I haven't been the husband you needed. I've been too focused on work, on providing, and I forgot to love you the way you needed to be loved. Rachel shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. No, Tom, this wasn't your fault. I'm the one who. Tom raised a hand, cutting her off. I'm not saying what you did was right. It wasn't. But I also know that I played a part in why this happened. Rachel fell silent, unsure of where he was going with this. Tom looked out the window for a moment, his jaw clenched, before turning back to her. "When I found out about you and Mark, I didn't know what to do. I was so hurt, so angry, that I just shut down. I didn't want to deal with it. So I threw myself into work, into anything that would distract me from the fact that my wife was with someone else." Rachel's heart raced. "I thought you left because I needed to clear my head," Tom said quietly. "And in that time, I met someone." The words hit Rachel like a slap in the face. Her mind went blank, her breath caught in her throat as she processed what he had just said. Tom met her gaze, his expression unflinching. "I didn't plan it, Rachel. It just happened." For a moment, Rachel couldn't speak. Her mind reeled with the realization that the man she had betrayed had, in turn, found someone else. She felt a strange sense of relief that Tom had experienced the same temptation, the same sense of escape that had driven her to Mark. But with that relief came a new kind of fear. What did this mean for them? "Who is she?" Rachel finally asked, her voice trembling. Tom looked away, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. "Her name is Claire. She's someone I met at work. It's not serious, but it made me realize that maybe we've both been living a lie, pretending we're happy when, really, we've been falling apart." Rachel stared at him, her mind racing. She had never expected this. She had thought Tom would either leave her or forgive her, but now, they were both standing on the edge of something new, something neither of them had anticipated. "What do we do now?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then, with a sigh, he said, "Maybe we stop pretending." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the weight of his words settled over her. The life they had once known, the marriage they had built, was gone. But maybe, just maybe, something new could take its place, something built on honesty, on shared experiences, no matter how flawed.